Hi everyone, good afternoon. This is Courtney from frevvo. Thanks so much for joining us today for our workshop on the database connector. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a couple different things to cover here. If at any point you have a question on the connector or anything that we're covering here in the class today, feel free to drop it into the questions panel, and then at the end of the session we will have some time to review any questions and lots of time to see if people have specific questions on your use case of the database connector. Let me just close my email there. Okay, so the purpose of this hour workshop is to look at the database connector from a designer's perspective. So we are not going to be covering the installation of the connector. What we're going to be covering is basically everything after you have it installed. And that would include, you'll see here the installations here on the top. We're not going to be covering the installation in the time that we have, but we are going to be talking a little bit about the configuring the database connector, what information you as the form designer need to know in order to utilize the connector in your workflows. We're going to be talking about the different queries that can be used in your configuration file, and then we have an exercise where you'll be creating a form from schema and using the database connector to pull in some dynamic options. So we've got a little hands-on activity at the end here, and then we can talk also about the other possibility, the other actions that are possible with the connector: create, retrieve, update, and delete. So at a high level, the frevvo database connector allows you to connect your frevvo instance with a SQL or Oracle database table. So it is the way that frevvo can authenticate with your database and pull in information. It can also write records to a database, update records, and delete them. And that can be done in a variety of ways, whether that is through business rules or the doc-URI approach. Okay. And we're going to be going over all of that. So before we kind of get into, that's really too much of the details here. So what I want to draw your attention to in the documentation is going to be our database connector tutorial, which is a very thorough going through of how to use the database connector, and it has several different exercises that expand upon the exercise that we're going to be covering today. When you are using the database connector, as I mentioned, you can connect with one or several different databases. And when you install the database connector, there's a properties file in that in the file when you install it. And that is where you can set your different connections. And so you can see here, this is an example properties file where you can, in this case, BERT is one database, My Store is another, Student is another. So this is where you would set up the URL to that database, and then also the user and passwords for that properties file. And this is how you can then reference these different connector properties in your configuration XML file. The configuration XML file is where you define the queries that you're going to use in your forms and workflows. So those are going to be your select statements. For example, we're going to be pulling back order details based on the order, an order number that is selected. So your select statement would look something like select the order number, the description, the amount, the total cost for all orders with this number. And so you're dictating the variable there is the order number that the user is picking. So let's take a look at the tutorial, because this really has the best examples here to look. Excuse me, I've sneezed. Okay. All right, so here is a query set, and let me just open that up here a little bit. Okay. So in your configuration XML file, you have the DB connector tag here, and then you have a query set. And so for each of your databases, each of your query sets, you can have multiple queries inside of that query set. Okay, so in this case, this is a query to get a list of all customers. It's a retrieve statement, and you have your select. So in this instance, we are spelling out each part or each column of data from the database table that we want to pull in to our form to set as options. You can do a select all, which you may be more familiar with SQL queries, but this method, it's more specific, a little bit more detailed. It helps, I think, when you're troubleshooting to see, is there a typo? Is it specific to a column type, whatever it might be, to spell out each individual column. So in this case, we want to select the customer number and customer name from, this is your table name, customers. So in your database, you'll have a table named, in this case, customers, and then we're ordering it by customer name. So this is going to pull back a complete list of our customers. And when you do that, when you have that query set up in your configuration file, you can then check that query in your browser. And so the format of this check here is your server import. So, and it's the server import where your database connector is installed, which is important. So if you are, whether or not you're installing whether or not you're using on-prem or cloud, you can use the database connector, and the database connector will be installed on your server. And so this is the server import where your connector is going to be located. In our case, for today's examples, our connector is on app.frevvo.com. Okay, so that server import is dynamic based on your instance. Database is static. BERT is your query set, your overarching query set there, your connection, your database connection. And then all customers is the name that you give your query. And when I put this URL, and I can put it in the URL for all of you as well, so you in the chat, so you can see what that looks like. Let me just open up the chat here. When you do that, what is returned is the JSON of the options that are in there. So you have, for each entry in the database table, you have a customer number and a customer name. And so you can see that there is data coming back here. Okay. If you have a typo here, you're going to obviously not get any results returned. So just something to look at that way. Okay. So again, this is an example of a query where you're pulling back options. And in our example form, we're going to use a drop-down control. And there's two different ways to set up dynamic options in a form. One is, the old way is through a business rule, where you would call the database connector, pass your query, and then set up your options in a rule. It's absolutely still valid to do it that way. Nothing is going to be broken, but we've made it easier to do it without coding as a property on the drop-down control itself. So I'm going to be showing you how to use that method because it doesn't require any coding, which is great. Let me pop back up here. Okay, and I'll pass along this slideshow PowerPoint to you all. It does have the example of how to set your options in a business rule. Okay, so you will have that example there as well. Now, there are other, as you start to build out your form, you're going to need more queries, right? So here's a query that returns all of my customer numbers, but then once I pick a customer, I want to bring back all of the orders for that customer. So now we start to get into a little bit more of a more detailed select statement. So I want to show you this one here. So this query goes inside of the BERT query set in our config file, and you could just order, list them one under each other in the config file. And this is your orders by customer query. And here we are returning the number, the date, the status of the order, and the customer number from a table orders, where the customer number, so this is your database column, and this is your customer number. And actually, in our example, we're not using CNUM, we're actually using SC, which is the select customer dropdown. So we're going to change that just a bit, but we'll get into that when we get into the example form. And then you can order by date. So this is the only part here, this defining the query, where you will need some knowledge of how to write a SQL query. And to be completely transparent, when I came to frevvo, I had no experience with SQL. And it took some time to go through the tutorials a few times and to really understand how the database connector works and all of that. But I will say that Google is your best friend if you have any questions on how to create those SQL queries, or if you're getting an error message while you're testing or anything like that, definitely take, like I said, I Googled a lot when I was learning how to create these query names and SQL queries. And if you, we will often work with like a different UI for SQL, like a workspace, where you can put your query into the workspace, and that can help you to determine where you may have an issue with formatting or something like that with your query. Okay, so let me just back up and see, are there any questions on anything up to this point? So we've talked about defining your database connections in the properties file. And then from there, you'll have a configuration file, and that's where you're putting in your query sets. Inside of your query sets are your individual queries that you'll need for your form. So I just want to pause there and see, are there any questions on that part of things? Okay. All right. Well, I'll keep going. Okay. So what I'd like to do first is have everybody log in to app.frevvo.com, and you'll see here next to your name you have a seat assigned to you, seat 1, seat 2, seat 3. So we're just going to go ahead and log into app.frevvo.com, and let's take a look at how to add those two drop downs into our form and connect those to our configuration queries there. And then we will talk about form schema and creating a form from schema. So when you log in to frevvo, you should see one project, which is the DB connector tutorial. This project here was downloaded directly from the tutorials page. And so it is using business rules to create the dynamic options in the form. And so we're actually going to create a brand new form and start from scratch so that we can use the web service. But you have all of these completed mini exercises to reference as you're working on your own forms with the database connector. So we're going to go ahead and create a new form. And from here, over on the left-hand side, we're going to just rename it. You can just rename it whatever you want there, DBC test or something like that. Oh, Wendy just let me know that the actual, yes, Uriel, I'm just to change this. Instead of seat 1 at training, you should be logging into seat 1 at frevvo training. Let me just make that change really quick. Thank you, Wendy. We changed our tenant. We created a new tenant since having this workshop. So, all right, there we go. So that is what we want to see here. Okay, that's what I want. All right, I'll give everybody a moment to log in there. And once you're logged in, if you would just raise your hand, and then I'll know that we're ready to move to the next. Okay, great. All right, excellent. Okay, so we created inside of the DB Connector tutorial project, we created a new form. Okay, and then we just named it DBC test, nothing fancy here. Okay, and we're going to be pulling 2 drop downs from the palettes. And this is a good time to mention that when we have a form that's going to be using the database connector, there's 2 approaches to creating the form. And in the case where we want to pull options from the database using the web service, we can create those fields from palette. So we can drag a drop down into the form, and that would be what we call from palette. If you are going to, like in our case, pull records back from the database using a select query, such that we're going to do when we select an order and then we want to populate a table with the details of those orders. Whenever you want to do kind of a get into a table, or if you have a form and you're going to be posting the data to a database table, the other approach is to create those fields from schema. So we're doing the from palette for our 2 drop downs, and then we're going to actually build out the orders table from the schema. So you're going to get to see both here. Okay, so this first drop down, we're going to set it to be select customers. Okay, that's going to be the label of your control. And then the name of that control should be SC. Okay, so you've got select customers, the name is SC. And for all drop-down kinds of controls here, you have an option source that you can pick. You can either choose design time, and if you were getting these options through a business rule, you would use the design time method, or if you were hard coding them or creating static options in the form, you would use design time. But we actually want to use web service. When you select web service, you have 3 new fields here: options URL, value binding, and label binding. The options URL that we want to use, and I'm going to put it into the chat for everybody, is visible here. And I want to break it down for everybody. So again, we've got app.frevvo.com. That is the HTTP, that's the server and port where our database connectors is installed. For most of you, when you do your database connector, it's going to be HTTPS localhost : 8082, or some, whatever server or port where you've got frevvo installed. If you're on-prem, if you're cloud, it's going to be probably just localhost, because that's where you would have installed the connector. Again, database is static. BERT is the name of our query set. All customers is the query name. And then you have a question mark, which is the end of that URL, and now we're adding parameters to the URL. And it's hard to see here because of the pink color, but it's an underscore media type equals JSON. So this is telling the URL to return the results in a JSON format. So go ahead and copy that web service into the dropdown, into the options URL. And remember when I tested this query in my browser, for each row returned, it came back with a customer number and a customer name. So these two objects here can be used for our value and our label. So again, with drop-down controls, you have, you always have your value that's being passed and then the label from what the user can choose from. And so in the case with the web service, you can either have those equal to each other, or you can say, I want my value to be the customer number and I want the name to be the descriptive customer name. So we're going to set our value binding equal to this here, which is, whoops, let me just type that in there. Result set / customer number. So that's going to be our value binding. And then our label binding is going to be / result set / customer name. And while you're all setting those properties, I want to show you how we can get those value binding and label binding pairs if you don't use the browser. Let me just see here. Oh, I gotcha. Okay. I forgot about this little piece there. So before you even have the value and the label in your form, if you're not sure what the different objects are going to be named, you can do like we did, run the query in your browser. The other option is to set the options URL in your form and then do a save and test. And in the debug console, you're going to see the JSON returned. And you can see here, here's our result set array. And then here you can see each option that's returned, or excuse me, object there, customer number, customer name. And that's another way that you can get those different value and label bindings. Okay. All right, so any questions up to this point? Does everybody have their value and label binding? All right, so now that we've got our select customer dropdown, let's give it a test. So you're going to do a save and test. And your options should be pulled back. If it doesn't work, you're going to see option 1, option 2, option 3, or an empty option, just the empty block. Okay. All right. And you can see, I mean, that just took us a few minutes to set up with, the options and values and labels and that sort of thing. And the business rule really doesn't take that much more time. There's just more opportunity for error there. Typo, spaces, what you name it. The JavaScript could be completely valid, but you fat finger the name of your query set or something like that. So this way you've got 3 places to go if something's not working, rather than a whole business rule with many more characters. Okay, so now that we have our select customers dropdown, we want to add another dropdown, and that is going to be called select order. The label of that will be select order. I want you to change the name to be SO. And just like we did with the customer dropdown, we want to change our option source to be a web service. Now the URL for this web service is a little bit different. Same server, same database, same BERT. Now we have a different query. So in our configuration XML file, we have an all customers query, and then we have an orders by customer query. So let's look at the tutorial and see what that looks like. Yep, so here is the query orders by customer. Now this is returning a lot more than what we're actually going to be using in our dropdown. There is some limitation with the web service in that with a business rule, you can concatenate multiple columns here to be your label. So in this case, and you can add in characters. So you can really change what that label looks like and really format it specifically. So in the example in the tutorial, we're using a business rule to pull back these orders, and you can see that they're setting the label of the option to be the order number, the date that it was set, and then the date time there. So in the business rule, you've got the number is the value, and then the number colon date. So there's some static text in there, and then whatever the order date was. When you use the web service, you have one object for the value, one object for the label. So this query does a little bit more than what we need it to do for our example, but we're not going to be changing the configuration file for this workshop here. All right, so back to our URL here. We've got our query orders by customer, question mark, end of that URL. And here we're going to pass two parameters. One is the variable of CNUM. So in our orders table, there is a column named CNUM, and we want to pass the sc.value. So whatever the value of our dropdown, customer dropdown is, that's what we're going to be passing in this query URL. And then we have an ampersand underscore media type equals JSON. When you run this particular query in the browser, okay, you have to pass a customer number. All right, and I just grabbed one customer number that I know has results in it. So I'll put that in the chat for you all to play around with. So this is CNUM242. The label of the customer is Alpha Cognac. And these are the orders that are returned for that particular customer number. Now, if you did a customer number that had no results returned, it is not going to return results. Now, sometimes, I'm not quite sure, sometimes it will show, what I would expect it to show would be just an empty results page. But in this case, I guess Google is sending me to the search page. So let me click back, sorry to be clicking around there. And the objects that are returned when we do that query, right, we've got order number, order date, status, customer number. For our drop-down control, we want to set the value and the label to just be the order number. That's what's going to be the most helpful in our case. So you've got your select order. You've got the URL, and let me just copy that for you all. Okay. Okay. So there is your URL. And your value and options binding are both going to be the same, and they're going to be set to order number. I think once you get the formula down for these URLs and the value binding, it's very formulaic. So you can just really plug in your query set name, your query name, your variables, and it gets easier. Once you know all the different pieces, it's pretty, straightforward in how you can connect to your different tables and queries there. Now, you may be wondering why this template. So typically when you have a template in frevvo, you just reference the name of the control in the template. You don't need to use .value. Because we are picking a drop down, an option from a drop down here, we have to use the .value, because if we don't, and I actually was just running into this problem this morning, what gets passed in the query is the value, is the label, not the value. And so in order to use a value from another dropdown to set options in our second dropdown, you need to use a template with the name of the first control .value inside of it. All right, once you've got both dropdowns set up, go ahead and give it a test. So when you first open the page, you will see no options available here. Okay, and then one way to kind of make that more palatable to the form user is to hide the select order dropdown until an option is picked from the customer's dropdown. So let's just go ahead and pick one here. So American Souvenirs Inc. You'll notice that there's no options available. And if we look, we can see there's nothing in the database table for that particular customer. But go ahead and pick Alpha Cognac, and you'll see that there are 15 results returned for that particular customer. And then in your order table, you've got them all listed, and they're listed in numerical order. Okay. So we're really halfway there with our form. We have a list of customers coming from a database. We have a list of orders for that customer coming from a different table in the database. And then the last thing we want to do is when I pick an order number, I want to display the details for that order. And this is where we need to get our database schema involved. Okay. So in your configuration file, you'll have a query that will pull the details by order number. And that particular query looks like this. Now this is a little bit of a different formatting, and I think that that's really for the purposes of the documentation to kind of outline it this way, but just in case you're wondering why that looks a little bit different. So this select statement is selecting product name, quantity ordered, price, product description, and then MSRP. And I believe that the different product name, quantity ordered as, this has to do with how the fields are named in the database and how we want them to be named in our frevvo form. And then the table is order details. And then we're looking at where the product code and the order number equal ONUM. I'm not sure about the product code, honestly. I'd have to ask about that, but I do know that this is the important value that we're passing, which is the order number. So once you have your query to retrieve those order details by order, the next step is that we need to generate the XSD schema from that query so that we can upload that schema to our frevvo project, and from there build out the form table from that schema so that we can use the document action of a doc-URI to automatically do the get for us. Again, our biggest thing here is going to be eliminating the need for code, because code is challenging to debug and it's time consuming. So if we can use a doc-URI that does the get automatically for us, then that's even better, right? Okay, let me see here. All right. So to generate that schema, you're going to browse a URL, and let me put this up here. We've got to do a little doctoring of it. So in the example, in the database tutorial, it's using, again, localhost. So we want to change that. That's going to be app.frevvo.com. Okay, and you'll notice now we have the database, the BERT. This is our query name, slash, and now we're looking at schema. And then you're going to pass just any order number. And when you pass that order number, what is generated is this particular format file. All right, so let me pop that into the chat so you can all get a chance to see that. Okay. All right, so if everybody could just get to this point, and let me help Nirosha here. Got a question. I'm going to unmute you, Nirosha. Okay,
Hi.
go ahead. Yeah, hi.
Yeah,
What's your question?
I have a problem in populating the orders because when
Okay.
I select the customer, it's not populating the orders. I'm getting an error saying control has templatized attributes with invalid templatized dependencies.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Okay. Would you mind sharing your screen and we can
Yeah,
take a look? Okay, great.
sure.
Let me make you the presenter.
Can you see my
Okay.
screen?
Yes, I can. Okay, I think it's telling you this because your select customers dropdown, is it named SC? So I also see that your SO has, yes, so you've used capital SC, you want to use lowercase.
Oh, that's okay.
And the
Oh,
same with the select orders. You should use lowercase SO. Okay,
so it's
go
case
ahead and
sensitive,
save it.
right?
Go ahead and, yeah, there you go. Now it's happy. Go ahead and give it a test.
Okay.
So definitely want to match your case when it comes to naming your, yep. And then pick the alpha cognac one. Yep.
Oh, yeah, that's
Great,
right.
excellent.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for that example because, you know, it's so, it just shows you how that little bit is really helpful. And frevvo's going to be able to debug when you're using a template in the properties file. It's going to tell you that there's something wrong there. So it's just the little things that we try to put into the product to make it easier for you to use these connectors. So good problem to show. Okay, so right, so we've got our schema here. And you'll notice there's a lot of stuff at the top. And then we get down to really the meat of the schema. And it's setting your, so it's going to create a repeating section in your form if the max occurs is unbounded. So we want it to, we know that we're going to be returning multiple records. When we pick the order number, it's going to return multiple records and create multiple rows in a frevvo table. So we want to leave this max occurs as unbounded. When you are creating a form from schema where your user is going to be entering in data and then you're going to be writing records to a database table, the min occurs becomes important because that's how you set a particular field to be required or optional. So if the min occurs is 1, then that field becomes required. And we don't have time to get into that today, but we can definitely take a look. If you have a specific example of something, we can take a look at it. All right, and so the other things to look at in the query here, you have your element name. So this is the name of the field that will be populated and created in frevvo. You have some max length restrictions. You have the type, the control type. So whether it's a string, an integer, double, meaning a number with 2 decimals, and in this case it's a money control. And then you have again another string and another double. So you may see date in this case, and you may need to modify this schema if you want your fields to display as something other than what is available in the form. So let me we'll pause, we'll put that conversation on hold for just a few minutes, and we'll work on getting this schema up into our form. So when you enter that URL into your browser and you get this schema page, what we need to do is save this as an XSD file that we will then add to our frevvo project. So you're going to go ahead and view the page source so that you have just what you have here without the header and all of that and other stuff. And then you can go ahead and save as. Oh, and in my case, it's not liking that. So if you're getting an error, the other option is you can just copy what you see here, open up TextPad, something of the like. Make sure you have no leading or trailing spaces that can mess things up quite a bit. And then you're going to save this as order. Let me just see here. Hold on. Okay. Order details by order. So let me go back here. Order details by order, and then you're going to save it as an XSD file, and I don't think my notepad lets me do that, so I'm going to save as all files, and then I'm just going to append XSD to the end here. I'm just going to save it in my downloads file for now. Okay, order details by order .xsd, save as file type all files, and we're good to go there. Right, so I'll give everybody a minute there if you have any questions. Once you have that schema, and if you don't have the schema saved on your computer, don't worry about it. It's already been uploaded to the project for you, so there is a version of this already there. So it's not super important that you download it and save it on your own for the purposes of today. But you're going to actually save and close your form, and you'll notice that in your project you have a schemas option in the menu here on the left. And the schema that you just generated has already been uploaded for you. And the way to upload that schema would be to just add content. You can name it. You don't need to worry about a description or an XSD file. You choose your XSD file, you upload it, and then it becomes available here in the list of schemas. You can also update these schemas. So if you go over to your menu, for each of these, let's say you needed to set one of the fields as min occurs 1 because you want it to be required in the form, you would make that change in the XSD file and then just update what you already have here. Okay, so we already have the order details by order. That's the schema we're going to be using in our form. So going back to our form, over on the left-hand side, we're going to be collapsing the palette. We're done with the palette now. Now we're building from schema. We're building from data, a data source. So you'll see the last option here in the menu is data sources, and you'll click new from XSD. And here are all of the schemas available for us to use in our form. Okay. And we're going to be using this one here, order details by order. You'll see here there's a create schema, there's a customer credit limit, there's an order details, and those are for inserting rows into the database table and creating a new order here. So we're going to be using order details by order. So you click on that plus and then you click on the green plus. You'll see behind your window here, you'll see when that schema's in the form, and you're just going to close out this top window. All right. So now if you open that, click to expand the order details by order, and you click to open the row, you can either add the entire row, which is going to add the repeating table, which we want, but you can also add individual controls from that row. So you don't have to use the entire thing as a whole. You can do it, a la carte, if you will, adding each field separately. We want to add the entire row. So I'm going to go ahead and click the green plus next to the word row. You'll see it puts it at the top of the page. I'm going to just pop it down to the bottom. Makes more sense in the order of things. And you'll notice that it adds it as a repeating section, which in some cases is maybe the look you're going for. In our case, we want this to be a table. So I'm clicking on the repeat, the outer repeat section there, and I'm going to display it as a table. Simple as that. When you have a control from schema, some of the fields are different, or some of the properties are different, I should say. Your table min and max, you'll notice, are not editable. Okay, max is unbounded, so it defaults to 32,000 and so on. Min defaults to 1. And you can change that min and max in a business rule, which we're using a doc-URI to get options from the database. If you wanted to do it through a business rule, you could certainly do that and then set min and max, and we have a documented example of that. If I click on the product header here, pretty straightforward in terms of table properties. If I click on the cell below, this is where I can display it as a different type of control. So with from schema controls, you can change them from they come in as a straight input text file, but you can change them to a text, money, radio, drop down, checkbox, or text area. If you, or radio, yeah, I said radio, okay. If you wanted this to be a combo box control, for example, or a date control, then you have to set that in your schema file. So you have to do some modifications there, and we have some examples of that in the tutorial. So product, sometimes the product can be kind of lengthy, so I'm going to change product and description to be text areas to allow for a lot of text to be returned in the form. Okay. So we did new from schema, we added order details, and then we added a row to our form, and we changed it from a repeat to a table, and then just changed the two different types of controls here, product and description. You can get a little fancy with the table. I think I had it as 25%, 10%, 10%, 10%, and then 25%. Oops. Nope, I've got them mixed up here. Hold on. There we go. Okay, you can also move this over. Yeah. So that might feel a little bit better there. Okay. So now we need to set up the get from the database. So that's done under the settings tab for the form. And if you're in a workflow, it's set up in the workflow settings tab, same place, under document actions. And we're going to be using the send data tab. We're going to be manually setting the document URI. And you'll notice that there's two documents here. There's the default document, that's the form itself. And then there's our schema document, the order details by order. We are going to be using this read URL, and it's pretty straightforward. Database BERT, we've got the name of our query, and then we're just passing the order number in that URL. So let me just copy that and put that into the chat here. Okay. So you just paste that URL in to the read query. You select the get method from the drop down to the right, and you're all good. Okay. Now, unlike the web service where you had to use sc.value, in the URL to the database connector through the doc URI, you don't need to use that .value. You also don't need to say return everything in a JSON. The connector takes care of it here for you in the doc URI. So we're going to go ahead and save and test. I'm going to pick our alpha customer. And in between picks, I like to clear the console to see what's going on here. And I'm just going to pick the first order. Okay, you can see here, it returned 3 results, did it all for me. Now, one thing that the toss up between using the doc URI and using a business rule is the doc URI is going to allow the user to add and minus, add and delete rows from the table because it's not setting the min and max of that table to itself, which would create more of a grid view. In a business rule, you can set the min and max equal to each other, and then you don't have the plus and minus icons. So that is one consideration when using the doc URI. On the flip side, when you're writing to a database table or updating it, you do want your users to be able to add rows and multiple records. So that's why you would want this table to be from schema. So just some things to consider there. Okay, so and you can kind of just play around and see how you pick, the different options here. Some have more than others. Excuse me. You kind of go from there. All right. So I'll let everybody have a couple minutes there. And I wanted to show you these 2 different uses of the database connector: pulling back options, dynamic options, and then retrieving records from a database table using the doc URI approach. We don't have, if we had another 3 hours, we could go and look at the other different CRUD operations, the create and the delete and the update statements. But we don't have that time today. So what I'd like to do now is answer your questions on the database. If you have specific questions, troubleshooting issues, anything along those lines, if you want to know more about different use cases for the database connector, I'm happy to share those as well. And then I'm going to put the link in here to the database tutorial. This is a very valuable resource for you if you are building a form connected to the database. Definitely go through that with you, go through that on your own. And I'm going to also put into, the chat a link. We have a YouTube video that, hold on. That's not what I want to do. We have a YouTube video that goes through the different CRUD operations. So I will put that into the chat as well for you. And I'll send you all of these links here so that you can see them, as well as the PowerPoint presentation from today. So let's see, we've got some questions. What is the default path to the configuration XML file? Great, okay. Oh, I think it should be in here. Let's see here, hold on one second. So if we go into the connector configuration, that is going to be where we find that information out. Okay, so the path there is going to be your frevvo home /config/configuration XML. The DB connector properties file is in tomcat conf and then dbconnector.properties. Okay, other questions? Oh, thank you, Megan. Megan let us know that, well, and in the directions, it does say that you're going to create that folder. You're going to create that config folder. So it doesn't exist by default in frevvo. Once you install the database connector, you'll create that folder. Lisa, your question, do you need to install the connector per tenant? No, you don't. So this connector can be accessed from different tenants, the connector that we're using for this example here. So tenant-wise, no, but most people do have an instance of the database connector specific if they have an on-prem version of frevvo. They have, for each version of frevvo, they have the, a different connector. I know you're in a different situation with being a reseller. So, but you can have multiple tenants using the same connector. Okay. Well, and as always, if you do have questions while you're going through the tutorial, certainly reach out to our support channel. You can reach out to your implementation manager and services. How can I prevent running the query from other computers on my network? I only want this SQL query to run from the frevvo server. I'm not sure I have the answer to that, except that the query is only going to run when it's triggered from the form. So wherever so I'm not quite sure the best way to answer that. I'm going to unmute you. Would you mind explaining more about that?
Yes, I noticed that when you copied and pasted the query onto a web browser, my concern is that some of our data we may want to be protected. My concern is that someone maybe have access to that and just copy and paste it from another browser and see the data. So I only want it to be from the form itself onto the database and no one else to be able to run that query.
Right, and I think so the way that our connector is installed, and maybe Megan, you might be able to answer this best, but if your database connector is using localhost, you're not going to be able to access that query. So like for example, if I did this, I should get an error message. Yes, right. So I'm getting, it's not connecting there. So I think that is maybe the best answer there. But let me take that question back and find out more for you, Uriel. But as long I can only run that query in my browser if I have access to that server. So
Okay.
do you know what I mean? So if I'm just like, if I tried to hit your database connector on your server, I would not be able to. I wouldn't be able to connect. But the database connector that's installed on app.frevvo is accessible to the cloud, to our cloud customers.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So if I use localhost, it'll run locally only, and no one else should be able to run it.
Right.
And they're accessing the form itself.
Right, except in the form itself. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I need something like that. All right. Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. Well, thank you all for joining today. And like I said, please let us know if you have questions. If it is your first form that you're connecting to the database and you have services hours, please reach out to us. We would much rather help you get started in the right direction than have you get started in the wrong direction, which has happened before. You get going on your form design and then realize, oh, I should have done this from schema, and then you have to rebuild your form. So we'd rather just, as you're doing your first form with the database, just have a quick little chat on how to best design it and let us get you started. And we know all of the different, pitfalls and little things that kind of can come up. So we can help with that for sure. So, all right. Well, thank you guys so much. And like I said, I will send the PowerPoint along as well as the recording of the class today and all of the links that we shared throughout the day. So have a great afternoon and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you so much.